All right. We're going to just go over some of the do's and don'ts of lead safe renovation. Just for a quick demonstration, because I always like to start off with one of those. Notice I'm wearing gloves. Let's say we've done our renovation, we've cleaned up everything, and now it's time to clean up ourselves. What's the last thing that we're going to take off? From our overalls, our hat, our boots, everything. What's the last thing we're going to take off? The gloves, because everything else was contaminated, so we keep the gloves on until the last. Just as you've done with everything else, or you want to do with everything else on cleanup, is fold it in on itself, so you're not spreading the dust around from the outside. Same thing with the gloves. All you're going to do is take them off inside out. Take them off inside out. You've done the same thing with your overalls. You sort of peel them down onto themselves, and they go in the trash. That's not trash, but okay. To give you a little background information, Illinois is the second leading state in the United States with lead poisoning. We have over 7,000 cases already on the books, mainly children. What are the two most common ways that children and adults can get lead poisoning? Now I'm talking about children under 6 years of age. Anybody have any idea on it? Pain. Well, we know that. It comes from pain. Okay. It's inhalation, you're breathing it in, and or ingestion, you're eating it. All right. Children, what happens when children get lead poisoning? And why do they get lead poisoning? Because paint chips with lead taste sweet to them. It's like candy. So if in fact they pick up a chip of lead paint and put it in their mouth, and children put everything in their mouths at certain ages, they're going to get lead poisoning. It's sweet. So they'll do it again and again without anybody knowing it. The other way is dust, okay? And the dust gets in the food they're eating, so on and so forth. What happens to children when they get lead poisoning? They can obviously go into a coma and death. It affects the central nervous system, and they can get anemia. It affects the blood and how the blood can absorb oxygen. Adults, how do adults mainly get lead poisoning? Mainly from inhalation, okay? Workers on the job in lead dust environments. And lead isn't the only one out there causing diseases, but lead is one of the most nefarious that is out there because of how it affects adults. Your peripheral nervous system can be affected. It can cause stress. Your heart system, your pulmonary system can be affected by it. And it can cause sterility. All right? That's one of its first effects, by the way. So you definitely want to be careful working around lead. How is lead tested? Well, there's a test called the blood lead level test. Does anybody want to hazard a guess on where most of the contamination is found in Illinois? Wrong, actually. Good guess, and everybody is going to say that, but it's not true. More cases are found in the collar counties around Chicago and in places downstate with very old homes that are being remodeled. And let's say a lot of homes have 2, 3 children in them. This is where the majority of the lead cases are coming from. It has nothing to do with the inner city. It has nothing to do with, there are numerous cases in Chicago that it's true. But the majority of the cases come from collar counties with older homes that are being remodeled and then resold. So Chicago's not alone out there, all right? This stuff is everywhere. Most countries in Europe banned lead paint in the 30s. It wasn't until 78 that the United States banned it. And we're still feeling the effects from that. A little side note, as we're working, the sign that you will be posting, if you're going to be getting into stuff like this, says no smoking, eating, or drinking. Again, inhalation or ingestion. A little side note on those signs, I have 2 generations of them. We're trying to be safe. We're not trying to scare people. So which sign do you think you would want to post to keep people out? This one? Right. You don't want to be, yelling poison in somebody's face. You just want them to keep out. You don't necessarily even want them to know what you're doing. You just want them to keep out. Why are children, this is really targeted for children under 6. Why is it being targeted for that? Because children's brains are still developing. The lead does affect the brain, first off, and as that brain is starting to develop, it can absorb more lead than an adult brain can. So this is where the main problem started manifesting itself. Most adults that had lead poisoning worked in certain industries. Believe it or not, sailors working on ships, shipping lead paint all the time, were found to be very susceptible to it. Submariners and people like that that work around high concentrations of lead paint. So we know that children are mainly susceptible, but adults can get it too without the proper precautions. What are some of the prohibited practices that we want to practice if in fact we suspect we're working on a place with lead paint? First off, dust is our enemy because you can breathe the dust in. But there's a number of other prohibited practices that we should be practicing. Number 1, no open flame burning or torching. That's torching of paint. When you torch or scorch paint, the lead turns into lead oxide. And not only now is it part of smoke, the particles of lead oxide are 1,000th of the same size as a particle of lead. So it makes inhalation even easier. So we don't want to be burning paint off the side of a building and releasing all this smoke out into the atmosphere, because God knows you're not going to know where it's going to come down at that point. It could be anywhere. Heat guns above 1,100 degrees. If you'll look in the stores now, most heat guns will say will not go to 1,100 degrees. That was not true in the past. Again, you're scorching paint at 1,100 degrees. So you don't want to be using an older gun that can go up to 1,800 degrees. You'll just be burning the paint off just like a torch at that point. Power sanding, power grinding, power planing. And then we go into needle guns, abrasive and sandblasting without shrouds. Okay. Even grinding in cement now, if there's paint on a building, those grinders have to have shrouds around them and be using HEPA vacs. I'm going to be using some terms a lot, and I will explain them as I go. Again, more prohibited practices. HUD even bans dry scraping and sanding, not even powered sanding. Just dry sanding and scraping is prohibited in a HUD building or in an apartment that is paid for by HUD. Dry demolition. And again, heat guns that can char paint. So if your heat gun you're using, in fact, is at 1100 degrees, but you're still charring paint, you can't use it. Okay. Dust is our enemy. What are some of the good practices we want to be looking to do? Wet scraping and sanding. Power tools that are designed with shrouds and that can be hooked up to a HEPA vac. Chemical stripping. That's again wet stripping. And there are some green chemicals out there that do a fairly good job also. So we'll just lump that in with chemical stripping. And if you are going to do chemical stripping, sometimes it is easier to remove what you want to be stripped, label it, and then send it off-site to have it stripped. That way you're not playing with it, and the household isn't playing with it. There's a stripping facility that's doing it for you, and they are, in fact, rated by the city in order to do this. And they're working wet, by the way, so they're not doing a lot of sanding. HUD says no demolition. EPA says no demolition. What are you going to do if you can't rip it out? Yeah, correct. Deconstruction and dismantling is doing it you're not just breaking down the walls and throwing it down a slot in the window into a big dumpster in the street anymore. Not with lead, you're not. You're taking whole portions of wall off, and then if in fact the wall has lead paint on it, you're going to be sealing that wall with plastic and then carrying it into a dumpster. Again, if you want to strip, think about sending stuff off-site or taking it into maybe a sealed portion of the basement where you can work with the stripper away from, the place that you're remodeling. Where do we find most lead paint? Most walls are painted with latex. There's no lead in latex. It's all the oil-based paints, prior to '78 that contained lead. Whether it's outside the house, most people use oil paint, and in kitchens, bathrooms, windows, and doorways where you have the high gloss trim, usually oil-based, where you use latex on the walls, oil-based, anything that got handled quite a bit, or heavy-use rooms such as kitchens and bathrooms, a lot of times got painted with oil paint, just because it was easier to clean than latex, especially the early latexes. You could clean it any number of times and you weren't affecting the paint. That's how good lead paint was, quote unquote. And that's why they used it mainly around windows, doorways that got handled a lot, opening the windows all the time. Okay, and by the way, opening the windows all the time that are painted with lead paint, where do you think most of the lead dust comes from in houses? Opening the windows all the time, you got paint scraping against paint. It's all dust, and it falls right onto the windowsill. And the kids are about yay high crawling on the windowsill and maybe licking their fingers. That's where most of it comes from. Doorways closing on themselves, chipping paint. Again, that's where most lead paint was used, and that was part of the problem. All right, so we know we just can't go in and pull things apart anymore. We have to systematically deconstruct things. If you're remodeling windows and you suspect the old windows had lead paint in them and you're taking the casings out and everything, that's fine. You're deconstructing, you're pulling the piece, you're not sanding them, you're not doing anything with them, except while you're taking them apart piece by piece, you are causing some chips to fall out. Do you think you want to seal the outside of the window so none of it gets outside? I would think so. I've used the term HEPA a number of times. There are different types of HEPA filters, both for your vacuums and for your masks, okay? This one just happens to be an N100, and by the way, that is recommended at 100% filtration, which actually means it's 99.99% effective. They call it N100, but there's just minute things that do get through. You will see N100. The N means not oil resistant filter. It will break down with oils. Now, why is oil so important? Specifically, if we're clothed in all of these items and it's warm outside, we're going to be sweating. Well, not only are we sweating, but we're also exuding oils out of our skin at the same time, and those oils can affect the filters. And certain substances in the air will affect the filters in vacuums, especially if we're chemical stripping, and then you're using that HEPA vac to take up any of the chips and or dust created. That oil paint is oil, so it will break down a HEPA filter, an N HEPA filter. There are R100 filters. R just means oil resistant. And then you get to P, which is oil proof. The filter will not be affected by any oils whatsoever in the air. So that'll give you a little explanation of the different gradings of HEPA filters. The recommended practice of working wet. When we say working wet, we're not going to take a hose to something and wet it down. What we're trying to do is just get a little mist onto the surface so that we're not creating dust when we're sanding. And if you've seen good drywallers work, they work with a wet sponge, not sandpaper and a block. I've seen a good drywaller sand a wall with a wet sponge, and not even a sponge sander, just a sponge itself. But this is how good these guys are. When we work wet, we use what is known as amended water. Not just fill up, the spray bottle with water. What's amended water? A couple drops of dish soap in that water. What that does is it helps the water to stick to the surface that you're working on. And it'll stay wet longer as opposed to just spraying it with water. The water runs down and dries off very quickly.
2 drops per how much water?
2, 3, 4, it doesn't matter.
How much water?
It doesn't matter.
Oh.
Just if you're going to be using a spray bottle, you're only going to be putting a little in. If you're using a sprayer on the side of your house, you're going to be putting more in. It's just there to help the water adhere to the surface you're spraying. You don't want to soak it, okay? You don't want to soak the side of your house and then be power sanding. Remember I said you can power sand. There are certain microplaners that are designed to take paint off the side of a house that are hooked to vacuums. Well, you don't want to be so wet that you're turning that into a slurry that's not going to go through the vacuum. All right, but just enough so that you don't have active dust flying through the air. So working wet is our friend when we're suspecting lead in the area we're working in. Now I keep saying suspecting, which is exactly what we work with. If somebody calls me and they've been cited by the EPA that there is in fact lead in your house or building, you've just gone above my head and probably your head right to an abatement firm, which will be required by the city. If in fact you have a cited building, even if you sell it next year, that building will be listed with the EPA for 30 years on a federal database. So I don't care how many times it's bought and sold, that building will always be notified. Anybody that buys that building will always be notified that there is in fact lead paint in that building, or has been, and there could be a hazard in that building. So once somebody has been cited, aka a sick child in that building is going to be on a federal record for 30 years. That can affect the resale of your building, and that's one of the reasons why we're not necessarily advertising that we're working with lead. There are a number of lead testing kits out there on the market. If in fact you've just bought a house and nothing was ever said about lead in there, and even though it is required for homeowners selling a home to say, hey, yeah, there's lead in here, okay, how many are actually going to do it? And how many realtors that are handling the sale are going to make them do it? So this is always something that is going underground, and that's why the EPA has come down so forcefully with it, because it's been going on for a long time and it continues to go on. So if you just bought a new house, or let's say an old house prior to 78, and you want to test, well, there are numerous things you can test with. Now, the EPA only recognizes this one so far. We used to be able to get this in a big multi-pack for about the same price as now we get two little pieces in here because unfortunately 3M bought the company. And it's the only one still recognized, by the EPA. So they can charge what they want for the test kits now. What's bad about this test kit is that it can't test everything, all right? It can't test anything with red paint in it because it turns red itself if there's lead in the paint. And it will leach red out of yellows, oranges, and reds. Anything with red paint in the mix, this thing can give you a false positive. So there are certain limitations that this thing can do also. How are you going to test for lead if you're using one of these swabs? Well, first off, you're going to take your handy little razor knife and you're going to cut a V-groove through the paint and into either the plaster or into the wood, so you've exposed all the layers of paint down to the surface. And then you're going to use the swab, because maybe the top, or probably the top layer of paint does not contain lead, but anything under it could. So you want to be able to expose that whole surface with a V-groove so that the swab can test all the layers. That will tell you whether or not you have lead or not. What you do with that knowledge is, again, up to you. But if you have children in the house, you'll obviously want to be doing some remodeling, to get rid of the lead. And again, I recommend deconstructing and just get rid of it. If you have a very old house with very fancy trim that unfortunately has been painted with lead paint and you want to preserve that, again, I'd recommend deconstructing it, labeling where it goes, and then taking it off-site to do the stripping. That way you're not recontaminating the area you're working in.
Quick question for you.
Yeah.
If you do deconstruct, you take that to an outfit that does stripping? Do they handle
Yeah.
that? Yeah?
Sure.
Okay.
They're
Right.
rated because they're working wet.
Okay.
They have big tanks that, they
Right.
put this stuff in. And it's really the best way to do it, if in fact that's what you're going to do. In fact, my mother's building, I took everything to the stripper. I just took everything, just took it all off and handed it to the stripper. And 2 days later, you're labeling on the back, when you're deconstructing, you're labeling on the back of the wood with permanent marker. The stripper doesn't affect the permanent marker,
Right.
so you're going to know where this piece goes back.
Do you have a list of places that do stripping?
I don't personally know.
This is a store, or could you, where did,
I don't believe we do.
it might be a nice thing to have.
I don't know if the Chicago Historic Bungalow Association might have a list. They certainly worked with a lot of old buildings.
Yeah, I'm sure somebody maintains a list somewhere, and the phone book. All right, if you are in fact going to do chemical stripping on site or in another location like the garage or the basement, there is a type of mask that will still have a HEPA mask, but they also, on the inhalation side, they have an activated charcoal filter in there, which is in fact very good for short-term use. I've actually had chemical floors put down that would literally, the fumes would make you sick, and I've worn the mask and didn't smell a thing. So I know they work. And then of course there's OSHA rated respirators for certain chemicals that you can change the filters on and everything like that if you're going to be doing this a lot. If you're a remodeling firm, you'd probably go with the respirator as opposed to the masks. Well, it's all contained in extremely heavy bags, all right? And those bags then are sealed, and then obviously you're gonna, at that point, have some sort of disposal system, whether or not it's a dumpster out in the street or whatnot. Again, and you're not gonna be sliding it down a chute at this point because you want that bag to maintain its integrity, so you're actually gonna be carrying it down and throwing it into the dumpster. What is a HEPA vac? For the purposes of this class, is your Hoover with a HEPA vac, with a HEPA filter, going to be good for our purpose? Your Regina vacuum that you use on your carpet?
I wouldn't want to use it for
Well,
this.
I understand, but is it going to be good for this? Does anybody have that answer? No, because the filter is not in the last stream of air of this vacuum. We're talking about vacuums that are rated by OSHA that are HEPA filtered. No air escapes these things that hasn't gone through the filter itself, or a combination of dust filter, bag, and then final HEPA air filtration as the last source of air going out of this vacuum. These vacuums are specially rated and tested by OSHA. There used to be, until about 2 years ago, one or two on the market because OSHA really didn't have anything published for the manufacturers to say this is the standard you must meet. And finally, about 2 years ago, that was printed, and now there's a bunch of companies that have OSHA rated vacuums. You'll see in the list you were given a HEPA vac with a beater bar. Again, we get back to our Hoover and Regina that we're doing the carpets with that's has a HEPA filter in it. That's not the kind of vacuum we're talking about. A beater bar attachment would be a big version of this. It's driven by the incoming air. And it's used, again, all the air is going into the vacuum, and the last exit is that HEPA filter. So a beater bar is strictly an air-driven beater bar and or brushes that will, help you clean the carpet of any lead dust in it. It's not a household vac by any means. Even a Dyson is not rated. Okay, I don't care how good they are, it's just not rated for any kind of work like this. All your power tools that you're going to be using, whether it's a jigsaw, a palm sander, it has to be connected to a HEPA vac, and it has to at least have the shrouds or certain attachments designed where it sucks up, the dust you're going to be creating. We always recommend, if you can, just work wet and by hand, but there's obviously some things that you're going to have to use saws on. We know that for a fact. Are we going to want to take out our power circular saw and go up the wall when we're deconstructing something? No. Okay, but if we have to use a saw, I would suggest using a saw like the Fine that has a small oscillating blade that doesn't kick dust everywhere, and they have a vacuum attachment for it. A jigsaw has the blade going, up and down, and you can get vacuum attachments for jigsaws. We're trying to create as little dust as possible. That's what you constantly want to be thinking about. How can I do this without creating dust? Instead of taking my saber saw and going down the wall, use the jigsaw or the Fine to cut that wall and then take it apart if you have to. Taking things apart. And who needs somebody like me to begin with my training? Well, any realty management firm has to have somebody trained. A construction firm that typically goes and does remodeling has to have somebody like me on site. And not all the time, by the way. I can train people. I can train my own crew. I can't train you as a class, though. I'm not rated to do that. All right? I can train my own work people on the job site and say, this is how you do this job. And then evaluate them and watch them, and then I can leave them alone. So construction firms need somebody with the training. Realty management firms that get into remodeling apartments need somebody with the training. Even, and I'm mainly an electrician, but occasionally I have to rip open walls. I was required to get the training, okay? It's what I do. Anybody that is going to be, working on a building as the trades, you as a homeowner don't need the training. That's why I'm giving this class to tell you what level you should be working at if in fact you suspect your own building has lead in it.
Austin, how does one get qualified then?
If in fact you need the people, well, this is one entity that is giving the training, is public health and safety. They can be reached online. and they'll have a list of training sessions and where they're going to be located at any period of time. And the certification, by the way, is good for 5 years, all right?
And do they have does a trained individual have a certificate?
Yes.
How do I know that you're trained?
Yeah, we'll have a certificate. We'll also have the book, and you are also issued a card, by the way. This card, it looks like something common that you could get anywhere, but it's not, okay? This is my old card. You'll see down at the bottom, there's holes punched in it. It just happens to be May of 15, all right? So this card expired now. So I had to get recertified. Hence the new book and the new card that is now goes to 20. So this card is good for 5 years. It's the same card, same pictures, laminated, but it's dated. And it's dated for a reason. There's 2 things that I, as a certified worker, have to do. Well, actually 3 things, but on the job, there's 2 things. Number 1, I have to be there for setup to make sure everything is being set up properly. And number 2, and then I can go away and let my crew do their work, let them do their things, because I trust them. But then I have to be back for cleanup, because I have to verify cleanup. And that's what the cards are for, and so on and so forth. All right.
Austin,
Personal.
are you going to go through what setup looks like?
Not this time. I'm going to go through a little bit of how it's set up. Okay, and a little bit of that, but I'm just getting into that. First off, personal protection. These laws were actually put into place not only to help the under 6-year-old crowd, but us as workers that were getting poisoned and didn't know it. So, hat, coveralls, duct tapes, any types of tapes, heavy contractor bags, boot covers, rubber gloves, not latex. Lead can go through latex. So we don't want that lead getting, through the latex, and then you're wearing a rubber glove all sweaty and it's getting into your skin. So nitrile, fine, no latex. Leather gloves, if you're deconstructing, you can put leather gloves over the rubber gloves. Mask, hood, if you really are getting into some heavy demolition, you may want to put a hood on and then the hat on. Anytime we're going to go to eat, or at the end of the day, you wash your hands thoroughly and at least wash your face. Controlling the spread of dust. Dust is our enemy again. Post signs. Remove, if you're working in your own house or an apartment with furniture in it, you cover everything. All right? Heavy duty plastic is our friend. Tape is our friend. Everything gets moved away from where you're going to be working and covered in that room. Or probably, if anything, taken out of the room, if possible. You're going to be covering the floor for wherever you're working. Let's say you're working on one window. 6 feet out to the side from that window and 3 feet back. The one good thing about lead dust is it's heavy. So unless you're burning it, it's going to fall almost straight down. It's been deemed that you only have to go out 3 feet. But they want 6 foot to the side just in case there's, any cross-contamination. You're going to close all windows and doors. And when I say close them, you're going to seal them with tape, if possible, or plastic sheet. You don't want this stuff being transferred out, if at all possible, unless you're working on the window. close and cover all openings and ductwork. And obviously, even in the winter, you're turning the furnace off. You know, in the summer, unfortunately, you're turning the air conditioning off. You know, you don't want this stuff going through a duct system. You know, all the openings are sealed, but you don't want it being sucked through any crack that it can go through into other parts of the house. So while you're working, in fact, the systems, you know, have to be shut down. After we're done, and before we leave, we're cleaning all our tools, we're vacuuming them out, and literally the final operation is that the vacuum itself is designed to clean its own hose. So even the vacuum cleans itself up. If you're working outside and you know that your siding has lead paint, you cover the ground to 10 feet out. If it's windy out, and there are some guidelines out there, but let's say if it's going to blow paint chips, you don't want to be working in that kind of condition. You're going to wait for good weather. If you're doing the whole side of a house that has to be repainted and whatnot, consider a vertical, you know, plastic sheet behind you. If you can go vertical containment and with wind wings, you're not, then you can possibly work in some windy conditions because the wind's not going to get to where you're working. Cleanup. Again, anytime we stop work, whether we have to go to lunch, whether we are done for the day, obviously the last cleanup is us. All right. If we're working in an environment that we're trying to keep dust free, and yet I have to go out for lunch, I have to take off my coveralls, my booties, my gloves. Obviously the gloves get tossed because you're not going to try and put them back on. So you need a box of gloves, obviously. Hat, everything off. There's a trick, another trick that I've used. We keep saying plastic sheets, and there's what we call a 3 plastic sheet method. And why do we use 3 layers of plastic? Easy, for easy cleanup. There are all 3 phases of the construction project itself. The deconstruction or demolition phase, bad word for lead remodeling, that is cleaned up. The first sheet of plastic is peeled off the floor, folded in on itself, just like I did with the gloves, you know, fold half, fold half, fold half, all right, and that goes into a plastic trash bag, by the way. And now the majority of my dust is actually out of my environment because I've done my deconstruction already and all the dust is sealed. Now I have to do whatever remodeling I have to do, all right, and I've got 2 layers of plastic on the floor. I put up a new wall, I install the electric, and somebody else comes and puts up the wall and does everything. Now we're not necessarily working with lead anymore, but we're still working with dust. So when the new construction is done, or the new window's in, and there's still little touch-ups to do here and there, when that's done, take the second layer of plastic off the floor. Now you're really clean. What's the final plastic for? For cleanup. Our vacuum is sitting on that final sheet of plastic. So all the cleanup is now being done in that room, whether we start vacuuming the ceiling, working high and working our way down, okay. The tools we're using to cleaning are sitting on the final layer of plastic. So when the job is all done, the plastic gets folded up and thrown away. And we're cleaning the plastic, by the way, while we're doing this too. Countertops, everything involved in the construction area. All right. I just explained the 3-sheet system, one layer on top of another that can be peeled off, folded in on themselves, and tossed away. I also mentioned clean from top to bottom because we're dealing with dust that's going to settle. So as we're vacuuming the walls and the ceiling and everything that need it, any dust that settles, we're going to catch on the way down. We're going to be vacuuming and damp wiping every surface we can, if in fact it can be damp wiped. All waste, all of it, is into the heavy bags. On final cleanup, mopping, and so on and so forth, the wastewater should go down the toilet only, and some municipalities even have regs on that, but that we won't get into. As we're doing a cleanup, by the way, remember how they said this stuff was bad for the environment because it was in all the laundry detergents and it caused algae blooms if it got into the water systems in the lakes, and then the fish couldn't get oxygen and it was killing fish? Well, that's still true, and it's no longer in laundry detergents, but it's still sold, and for a good reason now. If you're washing down and or mopping with TCP will coat lead particles, therefore making them inert. They can no longer affect anything because the lead attracts the TCP all around itself, the molecule, and it in fact becomes inert. Or TSP, yeah. So it is your friend now for this type of application. When we're mopping, and we're getting into, you know, the final cleanup type of thing, we want to be using a 2-bucket method if in fact we're mopping a floor with this kind of thing. So the first mopping, this is a 2-bucket method, or I could have just 2 separate entities sitting side by side, where I have the clean solution and then the dirty water. Okay, this has clean solution and dirty water buckets in it. 2-bucket method. So let's say we've mopped everything down, we've wiped all the surfaces down, and I come along, or you come along, and say, okay, I have to verify that this place is in fact clean. Whether I cleaned it myself, or somebody cleaned it, and then I'm checking on them. Or you hired somebody to clean it, and now you want to check to make sure it's cleaned properly. That's where the little card comes in. And I'll pass this around. You can take a look at it. And what it's doing is comparing a wet wipe, okay, that you should be using, new, okay. I'm going to use one on each windowsill. I'm going to use one on each countertop. I'm going to use one on each 40 square foot of floor, and then I'm going to check against that card to see, in fact, if in fact it's clean. If it can't meet that card, what do you do again? Re-clean, and again you're going to retest with the wet wipes. All right, so now you've done 2 cleanups if in fact it didn't meet the card. If in fact it fails the second time, you're going to go over everything with the electrostatic dry wipes and then consider it clean. All right, because the dries will probably take care of everything else that is there. The second time I go to clean, what did I do with the first mop head? Reuse it? No. New mop head. Okay. First one gets tossed away because the cleaning got failed. You're not going to reuse it again, even if you've got new water and the old dump water was, you know, out, and you've cleaned the buckets before you added, you know, a new cleaning solution into them. you're not going to reuse that old head. You're going to throw it away because it's contaminated already, and you failed the first test.
These strippers don't detect lead, so what are you detecting on that? What, dirt?
Dirt.
So what if your environment is not clean to begin with? Are you doing a service then for the
Yeah.
occupant? Cleaning his
You know, a lot of contractors thought that this whole process was going to cost them lots of money, okay? Where the opposite went into effect, because now, as they're working, they're cleaning up as they're working, all right? A friend of mine used to go into a house, and his criteria was it would be broom clean for the owners at that point. When he was done, okay, the outside, all trash picked up, everything broom clean. So maybe the homeowner has hired, a painting contractor to come in and so on and so forth. Now, he has one guy doing the cleanup on the last day, where it used to be the whole crew was there, 8 people cleaning up all around. How did he save money? He's paying one guy instead of 8, because everything was cleaned as they went. Took a little more time, but that little more time was offset by the cleanup. So this whole process is not costing as much money as contractors thought it would. And speaking of contractors, as I was taking the course, and this is how insidious this can get, $3 million house, newly made, finished, okay. Guy I was talking with at the course, he's the painting contractor. He's one of the last in. They're approved, the homeowners that approved what they want painted. He's painting inside and outside. He comes on the job. The contractor that he that subcontracted him knows the guy. Here's a knowledgeable contractor, a knowledgeable architect, totally knowledgeable people building a high-end home. And the painting contractor looked around and he said, "Is that what I think it is?" On the soffits and everything, they had lead-coated copper. They had just contaminated the whole house. And he said, "You got to get that off." Just finished. Where did they even get the stuff? It's not made in the United States.
What's it for?
Waterproof trim outside. It just looks good. And it weathers nicely.
Is TRNE another word for that stuff? Term? TRNE? I've heard of roof space.
Well, but I mean, here's a knowledgeable contractor taking his test for the second time too. He looked at it and went, "Whoa, it's still out there. It's still being used." He talked to the contractor, and then obviously there had to have been some negotiation somewhere. They had to take it all off. It just went through everybody's brain. They didn't even think that this lead flashing, if you want to call it that, is designed to wear through the weather. Well, where does it wear to? Right into the ground. Okay? And now the ground all around your house is contaminated and will be right at the start, So you really have to be aware of what's going on around you when you're doing this kind of thing. So we went through cleaning verification and how to do it. And make sure I get that card back. And that's it.
Are there any questions?
Now, I will give you one more trick, by the way. I promised to do that. Sticky plastic, okay? This just happens to be sticky one side. There is a product that you can use, sticky both sides where you can just lay it on the floor and it's not going to move. This is fine too, I've used it. And it's used to take the dust off the bottom of your shoes, even though you vacuumed them, final as you're exiting the work area. And if you wanted something movable and you have just some old plywood laying around, you take the sticky side up, you can duct tape under it, okay? And anytime you want to renew the surface, then you've got the sticky side up, and you just put another sheet right on the sticky side, and you got a new sticky side. And you keep doing that, and then at the end of the project, if the project was 3 days, you throw the plywood away. Bagged, of course.
You had a question?
Yeah, I've got a wall that needs to be repainted, and I know it was all done before 1978. I'm going to have to check it for lead. Because of some decorative paint that someone else put on, which creates a texture on it, a contour, it has to be sanded flat before I can repaint it. If I use
Not
proper
necessarily.
protection, I'm talking about lines that someone else put on that are like maybe 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter that have
Well, it all
stick
depends
up.
if you want to keep that decoration
I
or
don't
not.
want that.
Well,
I want it flat painted. But if I use proper protection for myself and for the premises, can I do manual dry sanding on that? Just to get it smooth?
how about manual wet sanding?
What?
Wet sanding. Wet sandpaper. Same
Okay.
thing.
Okay.
Just a little mist is what you're doing. You're not soaking the wall.
Yeah.
Okay, just a little misting, and then use what's known as wet dry sandpaper.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Or you can use, there are some companies that do have power sanders, Porter Cable for one, that this disc sander is totally shrouded, and then that shroud goes into a HEPA vac. So that would ease things down too. But yeah, and even if you're using something like that, you still want to mist a little bit just to keep any stray dust down. But yeah, most definitely. Work wet.
Another question?
What about shop vacs? Those are not useful for HEP applications, or can they be converted at all?
You cannot convert, okay? When we're talking about shop vacs, this is the type of vacuum that are rated for this type of work. But they're specially rated vacuums. They're still considered shop vacs, okay? But they are rated for OSHA as 100% effective in taking dust out of the air. Just because it says HEPA shop vac doesn't mean it's rated by OSHA. All right, there are a lot of shop vacs have HEPA filters in them, but it's not at the last filtration stage. Sometimes it's in the middle, sometimes it's at the beginning, and they are not rated. So you will see labels on the vacuums that are in fact rated for this type of work.
What about lead in varnish?
Same process. Sure.
So floors, or you're sanding a floor?
Now you're getting into tough. Again, at that point, you may want to consider chemical stripping that floor as opposed to normal sanding. A lot of varnishes didn't have lead in them, though. Some did, yes, but not a lot.
What about stripping lead chips with a pressure washer or power washer?
No, for a good reason. A pressure washer is going to blast those chips everywhere, all right? Let me add one thing to that. Let's say you were in fact doing that on the side of a house. You would want vertical containment with wind wings, all right? Yeah, could you get away with it? Yes, okay, with containment methods. You'd want that whole wall sealed off, 10 feet back, ground covered, all right? Because you're going to be blasting paint chips everywhere with a high pressure washer. So you have to think about how that is going to affect it. Yeah, it could be done. There are better ways to do it. Like I said, those microplaners can take off a layer of paint and do it cleaner than a pressure washer.
Any other questions? One more.
Where does the trash end up?
In a
Ordinary,
dumpster, basically.
but an ordinary landfill?
Yeah, but again, it's contained, and especially on the cleanup, if you're using, the TSP, it's neutralized. So even dumping the water, that lead that you wiped up is neutralized by the TSP. So, yeah. Now, can a contractor do that? It depends on the municipality you're in. There are some municipalities that are going to say, no, this has to go into a hazardous dump. Depends on where you live. But a homeowner, even by HUD, in the dumpster, and homeowners on their own, basically.